All right, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Good morning, Ada. Good morning, Danielle. Good morning, Elizabeth, Jennifer, Oscar, Peter, Robert. Good morning, Terry. Welcome to the HR Roundtable. I'm going to wait for some folks to file in here, and we've got a going to have a great presentation for you this morning. Good morning, Mary Lee. Brian, how are you, sir?
Good, Roger. How are you?
Good, good. Good morning, Taronda. Good morning, Selena, Carlos, Andrew, Claudia. All right, welcome, welcome. We're going to get started in a few minutes. We'll give folks some time to arrive and realize that it's 11. Unlike all of the early birds here who are popping in. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Nadira. So we've got a great presentation for you this morning. We're going to be using the Q&A tab for all questions coming in. Good morning, Kai. Good morning, John. As opposed to the chat window. So we're not going to use the chat window for questions. We use the Q&A tab there, and we will do our best to get to all of your questions. Good morning, Donato. All right. Junacia. Good morning, Junacia. That was a tough pronunciation there. I'm not sure I've had enough coffee. I can't read until I've had 2 cups at least. All right. Good morning, all. Nice to see everyone. We're going to get started in a minute. I just want to give folks a little time to file in here. Let's see. We have 11:02. We'll give it one more minute, and then we will get started. Hope that everyone is having a great summer so far. So nice to have the weather have improved so much. Good morning, Heather. Mr. Hanley, good morning. We were all just, dying under the heat and humidity, and let's not forget the wildfire smoke. Just to add insult to injury here, but the 10-day forecast is just looking mint. Beautiful, beautiful weather. Ziamara, welcome. Good morning. All right, very good. So we are going to get started. Give me one sec. Before we get started, I'm just going to introduce my my partner here in the HR Roundtable, Brian Bulger of Marsh. He also runs a CFO Roundtable for any CFOs on the call this morning. Brian, if you want to say hello.
Good morning. I'm looking forward to today's presentation. Fabrice is going to do an awesome job, and it's just great to be here. So sit back and enjoy, guys.
All right. Thank you so much. All right. I'm going to grab the screen over here for a sec. And just give you, for those of you who are perhaps here for the first time, the HR Roundtable is a monthly seminar series brought to you by the 10 Positions group of companies. My name is Roger Oliver. I'm Director of Strategic Accounts and founder of the roundtable, along with Brian Bulger. And just to give you just an idea of what Temp Positions is quickly, we are a multifaceted staffing solutions firm. We do temporary, temp to hire, and direct hire, and we do it across a really wide range of skill categories. I think that is the key point. So as you see here, all the different divisions are all branded with a name to reflect the different sector being covered. Account Positions is our accounting and finance division. So a full range of accounting and finance professionals there. CompuForce for IT consultants and solutions. HR Staffing Solutions, near and dear to the hearts of everyone on this call. We provide HR consultants on all levels and all major disciplines of HR. So when you need extra hands to help with projects, we're there to assist. On-call counsel is our legal division, so we're providing attorneys, paralegals, and other professionals. School professionals is our education division. We're providing teachers, tutors, and other education professionals. We also are the engine under the hood of the New York City UPK program. So anytime you hear Universal Pre-K in New York City, we are the engine under the hood. We are providing the pre-K teachers for the overwhelming majority of those community-based organizations that are running programs. Convention services and hospitality are kind of twins or cousins here in the hospitality space. So waiters, bartenders, culinary professionals. We have a large healthcare footprint in social service. We provide services to organizations that are themselves providing services to people with developmental disabilities, child welfare, shelter programs and domestic violence shelters, and lots of populations, including currently the migrants and asylum seekers who are here in our city, in our midst. We are staffing the 40+ hotels with healthcare professionals, liaisons, RNs, LPNs, case managers, and all the things that are needed to care for the migrants and asylum seekers that are coming in. We're doing that here in New York City, and we've just started in Vermont as well, where they've got a lot of challenges there. And then lastly, to round things out, logistics for sort of warehouse and manufacturing environment. Our flagship Temp Positions, where the organization started, in administrative admin assistance, everything in terms of general office support. And then lastly, creative for the Creative Bureau for all things web. If you need to revamp your website or anything that's customer facing in your business, in your organization, we have talent for that. And lastly, our TGC Search, which is our executive search division. So we're able to help you with direct hire as well for all of those needs. Elise, you can grab the screen back for a second while I introduce our speaker for this morning. I'll stop share here. All right. Give me one second. All right, so we are very lucky this morning to have an expert in his field. Fabrice Hodart is our speaker. Fabrice is a human rights and corporate social responsibility specialist with 20 years of experience at the World Bank and the United Nations. He's the executive director of the Association of LGBTQ and Corporate Directors and an advisor to Fortune 500 companies through his consulting firm. He serves on the L'Oreal Global Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board, for 2001 and 2002, and on the editorial board of the Women's Forum, and an adjunct professor in Global Human Development Program of Georgetown University. Previously, he was a human rights officer at the United Nations, Office of the Commissioner of Human Rights. And in this position, he co-authored the UN Corporate Standards of Conduct for Business, and the largest LGBTQ plus corporate social responsibility initiative supported by more than 500 of the largest companies in the world. Additionally, he led a project on campaigning for equality in Africa. Prior, in 2002, Fabrice was listed amongst the board list of 10 LGBTQ plus candidates you'd be proud to have in your boardroom. LinkedIn's top LGBTQIA voices, and Crain's New York notable LGBTQ for 2002. He volunteers on the board of several nonprofits and works in nonprofit fighting the twin crises of AIDS and homelessness in New York City, amongst other great many accolades. And we are very happy to have him here this morning. So Fabrice, if you want to grab the screen, I will leave you all in the very capable hands of Fabrice Hodart. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Roger, and thank you, Brian, for having me. I have to say that I owe you a great debt of gratitude, because my children did benefit from free pre-K in New York City.
Oh.
So thank you very much. And then you know, I heard you say that I was going to have a great presentation, and Brian said that I was going to do an awesome job. So now I feel a little bit of pressure to at least not cry on screen. So I'm going to share my my presentation, which is right there. So, you know, I think that LGBT inclusion in the US is kind of an important topic at the moment, particularly because of the entire debate that took place around corporate engagement during Pride this year. But also, I think because there is a lot of questions around transgender issues in the United States. So I'm really grateful that we have an opportunity to talk about it today. And, you know, I have developed for my clients this kind of 8-step approach, right? And the idea is that LGBT equality in the workplace is a journey, right? And that the bar for equality always gets a bit higher. And the reason I say that is because I think that's true not only of LGBT equality, but it's also true of gender equality or racial equality, that, you know, you always have a next stage in your engagement. And, you know, you mentioned the fact that I work with L'Oreal. So L'Oreal is a very advanced company when it comes to LGBT equality, but they still have some things that they can think about, right? As an example, you know, now non-binary employees are coming in the work stream, and how do you accommodate non-binary employees, the use of pronouns, you know, those questions kind of come up. But of course, the first step is probably to acknowledge the fact that LGBT employees have specific needs in the workplace. So, you know, I'm going to read quickly the workplace, but the steps, right? But I think the first 2 steps are really about making the case internally for LGBT equality. And even though it might be obvious to you that racial equality, gender equality, LGBT equality, inclusion of people with disability does matter to the workplace, that might not be the case of everybody in the company, right? People might have legitimate concern, such as, is that a distraction from business? Or is that going to restrict the freedom of expression of employees that might have different religious beliefs, right? And so making sure that you have gone through this step might be crucial to the other step, right? Meaning making the case internally for LGBT equality. Then I would say that there is some quick wins you can make in improving workplace environment for LGBT employees. And one of the things that I'm going to talk about is the importance of tone at the top. You know, in my experience, what makes a huge difference is leadership. Whether leadership believes that LGBT equality is good business, or whether leadership feels that they have to do LGBT equality because of pressure from younger employees, or because of woke culture in the United States, right? If the top is not really on board, usually it's kind of difficult to overcome. Then we will talk a little bit about self-ID. I think a lot of companies have been on that journey, right? Giving the opportunity to employees to identify as LGBTQ+, whether it's during onboarding or in a staff survey, right? A lot of companies have done that, but I have a client on the West Coast, which is a bank, rather conservative, and they don't have self-ID. And frankly, what I told them is I said, well, look, first you have to work on the environment, and then we can discuss about self-ID, right? And then I want to talk about career success. One of the things that Roger mentioned when he was introducing me is that I lead a nonprofit that tried to improve representation of LGBTQ+ people in the boardroom. And the reason is because we have done a lot of progress on rank and file employee inclusion, right? LGBT employee inclusion. But then when it comes to senior management, the C-suite, sometimes the board, right? Usually there's huge underrepresentation. Then I want to talk a little bit about metrics, right? How do you measure success? Which is kind of the question of our seminar today is my workplace LGBT inclusive? And then I will talk briefly about what it means to live those values outside of the company. There were a lot of drama during Pride season. Anheuser-Busch got caught up in their engagement around Bud Light externally. Disney was in a bit of a pickle for most of the year. Target was also met some issue. Are there lessons learned about is it risky for a company to express those values outside of the walls of the company? So basically, this is the steps we are going to discuss today, right? Those 8 steps. So starting with the first step, adopting a human rights lens. So Roger kind of said that I used to be a human rights officer and that I co-wrote the standards. So that might be why I'm trying to sell you my dog food. But the reason we created the standard is because a lot of companies looked at LGBT issues as being a philanthropic engagement. Meaning, look, I'm good to my LGBT employees because I'm a progressive company, or I'm good to my LGBT employees because we are a company that wants to do good. We wanted to remind the private sector that there are human rights responsibility related to LGBT people. In the same way that gender equality is a human rights agenda, or racial equality is a human rights agenda, right? Similarly, companies do not consider the fact that they're banning child labor or human trafficking, or that they respect the privacy of their customers and employees as being a philanthropic engagement, right? They look at it from a human rights lens. So that's why we wrote the standards. They're available on a website, unfe.org/standards. And as Roger mentioned, they are the largest corporate social responsibility initiative on LGBT issue, meaning that more than 500 of the biggest companies in the world have expressed support for the standards. Think about Royal Caribbean, Salesforce, Microsoft, L'Oreal, LVMH. Most companies have expressed support for the standards. Most large companies have expressed support for the standards. And the standards are not rocket science, right? They remind companies that they have an obligation to protect their employees from discrimination. but they also must look at the upstream and downstream of the supply chain, meaning they must make sure that their suppliers are also protecting LGBTQ plus people in the way they are doing business. And of course, when they sell product, they must ensure that they are not discriminating against LGBTQ plus people, right? This is a human rights responsibility, right? It's a direct translation of the human rights, the United Nations guidelines on business and human rights of 2011, which were endorsed by the Human Rights Council. Now, acting in the public sphere, meaning acting outside of the walls of the company, that's certainly not a human rights obligation. Some companies decide to do it. It is my personal belief that it has a very positive impact on LGBT rights. But what I want to reiterate is that the real obligation of companies is protecting their employees, right? And that's a human rights obligation. So that might look like slightly irrelevant to our conversation today, but I will tell you why it's relevant, which is that when you make the internal argument for greater LGBT inclusion, using that human rights language is sometimes a way to appear as more neutral, right? To show that, look, I'm not pursuing a political agenda or a woke agenda. I'm just ensuring that the company respects its human rights obligation. So, if I manage to move to my next slides, I put that map of ILGA, which shows the criminalization of homosexuality throughout the world, right? Today, only 68 countries are criminalizing homosexuality. Some of them get in the news very often. Some of them are actually hyper-criminalizing, meaning going beyond criminalizing same-sex act, right? Uganda, Ghana are countries that either have a law in place or are considering punishing LGBTQ plus people just for representation in the media, or forcing employers to disclose if their employees have identified as LGBT. The reason I'm saying that is to say, well, look, this is a human rights engagement, right? It's not just a workplace environment or engagement, it's a human rights engagement.
So the organization ILGA, what does that stand for?
Sorry, yeah, I should have mentioned it. So it's the International Gay and Lesbian Association. Really now it's the International LGBTQ plus Association, and it's a global nonprofit that kind of works toward LGBT equality, right?
Thank you.
So, the darker the shade of red, the worse the criminalization is, right? And when you get to really dark red, it means death penalty, right? So Mauritania, I think I see maybe Yemen. And so, it's good to remind sometimes corporations that it's not just a workplace inclusion agenda, it's also a human rights agenda. So, enough about human rights. I thankfully, I managed to escape the United Nations in 2020. So I have another argument, which is the business case. And in fact, when I work with my clients, I work very hard on the business case because I don't believe the business case is just a gimmicky way to say, well, look, you have to be nice to LGBT employees. I really believe, and I would love to discuss that with you, that there is a demographic revolution. And, the first time I heard that 20% of Gen Z identify as LGBTQ+, my reaction was, this must be a bullshit statistic that LGBT people have produced, right? Because it seems so high. Now, it's not only Gallup that has those findings, it's also Ipsos, right? Both Gallup and Ipsos are those very big statistical agencies, right? That carry out surveys throughout the world. And so I put in parallel on the left that Ipsos survey and on the right that Gallup survey. And, so the number of people, of adults that identify as LGBTQ+ varies a lot from one country to another. Interestingly enough, 15% of Brazilians identify as LGBTQ+. As you can see, in France, where I am right now, it's only 10%, right? And usually it's related to how supportive the environment is. In the United States, it has been pretty consistent. 7.2% of the population self-identify as LGBT. So as you know, those numbers are mostly driven by bisexual people and non-binary people, meaning that's the biggest growth, right? A lot of people are increasingly identifying as bisexual or as non-binary. The reason why it is important is that this number grows to 20% when we talk about Gen Z. So, of course, it reflects a change in society around the way people relate to their sexual orientation and gender identity. The more tolerant the environment, the more willing people are to say, well, I have some level of attraction to the same sex. Or the more tolerant people are saying, I don't recognize myself in the male or female category. Whether we like it or not, this has a gigantic impact on corporations. Because employees that self-identify as non-binary, as an example, have specific needs, and they actually report the specific needs in surveys. And then similarly, if you are Ford and you're selling cars, I can tell you you're not going to sell cars the same way in 20 years from now. And the reason is because people want to be seen in the commercial process, right? I love to say that as an example, as a gay man, you know, I love motorcycles. I have a Triumph now. I had a Ducati before. I never felt comfortable in an automotive concession. You know, when I go to the automotive reseller, I don't feel comfortable, right? I don't feel reflected in the sales force. You know, it's historically a place where I don't feel very comfortable. And I think that's more of what we are going to see, right? Which is non-binary people and bisexual people, but also gay, lesbian, and trans people want to recognize themselves in that commercial process. So I think it has a big impact on the business, right? On the talent, but also on the consumer. And I think that articulating the fact that this is relevant to the bottom line, meaning profit, can also help an HR professional setting the ground for greater LGBTQ plus inclusion initiative. So I told you, well, look, LGBTQ plus people have specific needs in the workplace, and that's a bit of a vague comment to make. But so if you look on the left of these slides, I have listed a few questions that LGBT people frequently ask themselves in the process of their career. You know, and as an example, one of the first things that I ask is, as an LGBT professional, I can ask myself, should I change my career goals because of homophobia? And that might seem a bit of a dramatic question, but I will tell you something, you know, practical example, a personal example, right? I worked at the World Bank, as Roger mentioned, for 14 years. And, you know, I could see myself progressing maybe to become a manager, you know, maybe a director in a supportive function, right? Not client-facing, but maybe, you know, policies or maybe administrative function. But I could not see myself as a vice president, a senior vice president, or managing director. And part of it, you know, part of it might be a lack of self-confidence, but part of it was also because I did not see people like me in those positions. And it might sound a bit frivolous as a comment, but what it means is that it hasn't, you know, if LGBT people don't see themselves reflected in senior management, it does affect the way they envision their career. So then, you know, of course, you have the situation of handling sexual harassment, right? Very often, you might hesitate to report to HR same-sex sexual harassment if you think that coming out or reporting the fact that the person that is harassing you has same-sex attraction might be ridiculed, right? Or might be the subject of gossip, right? And then similarly, you know, the fear of being outed. I mean, you know, all of those questions are very relevant to LGBT people, and they affect their loyalty to the company, it affects retention, it affects productivity, and ultimately it affects success, right? So that's why that business case is important, is to say, well, look, if we don't have those LGBT initiatives, our talent is not going to affect positively the bottom line. You know, I put a little bit of a statistic on the top right hand, in which I said 50% is the average of percentage of LGBT people being out in the workplace in Fortune 500. And it's really important because Fortune 500, most of them, you know, besides maybe Chevron and a few conservative companies, have made tremendous effort on LGBT inclusion. And yet, people continue to be in the closet. And the reason they continue to be in the closet is that LGBT people are never going to take any risk to impact negatively their career. And so they will always scan the universe in saying, well, could it be to my disadvantage at some point? And I'll tell you, I have a very big client that has a senior vice president with a lesbian, and she's in the closet. So the CEO came to see me and he said, well, look, Fabrice, we're doing very good on LGBT because look, we even have a lesbian with a senior vice president. And he said to me, but she doesn't talk about it because it's her private life. And, you know, I didn't want to lose my contract or be antagonistic, so I didn't say anything. But in the back of my mind, what I thought is that the reason she's in the closet is because she has a chance at becoming CEO. And she doesn't want to pass that chance because the board is going to be like, oh no, a lesbian does not really fit the image of the company. So what I mean is that people have very good reason to stay in the closet. And until the environment is really supportive and they know it's not going to impact them negatively, they will not come out. You know, then I put a few statistics here. As I mentioned to you, only 0.7% of Fortune 500 board members are LGBTQ+, meaning closeted or semi-closeted or not. There's 28 individuals, which is very little, that are LGBT. You know, some of them, you know, they are the 4 out CEOs in Fortune 500. Tim Cook at Apple, Beth Ford, the CEO of Land O'Lakes, a very respected lesbian, Jim Fitterling, the CEO of Dow Chemicals, who came out at 54, and Jeffrey Jeanette, who is the CEO of Macy's. So that represents 0.8% of all directors on Fortune 500. So, you know, just as a reminder, I mentioned that we represent 7.2% of the American population. So now, you know, there is another aspect to this economic and business case, which is that a lot of academics have done studies showcasing that there is gains to be made for companies in terms of individual performance, in terms of business performance, and even at the country level, right? When I was at the World Bank, I carried out a study which estimated the cost of homophobia for India. And since then, the study has been replicating many times, right, to show that companies that are inclusive, that countries that are inclusive, perform better. So it's true at the business level too. You know, we see constantly that LGBTQ+ people, when they are in supportive environment, do strive, their loyalty improves, their productivity improves. And then, you know, at the board level, I very often quote studies that have showed that diversity of opinion, when people can fully be themselves in conversation, has benefits in terms of decision making, but has also benefits in terms of profit making. So, you know, a lot of people believe that those statistics are a little wobbly, or they are not completely sure that it makes the case for having LGBTQ+ policies and initiatives in place. I really do think it is. And so I would encourage anybody that is starting to make the case internally for initiatives like creating an employee resource group to consider articulating the business case that we mentioned earlier. So Roger, I wanted to check, am I fine with the way I'm managing my time? Do we have any questions?
Yes, absolutely. I want to I was going to see if we take a pause here. Do we have questions? Do you want to pop any questions into the QA? tab there, we're going to ask the first of our poll questions in a second here to poll the audience, gauge the audience a little bit. But if you do have questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A tab there at should be at the bottom of your screen, as opposed to the chat window. Please put them in the Q&A. All right, everyone's shy this morning so far.
Oh, good. So
all right, we have our first poll question, and which is, how inclusive is your current work environment? So everyone take a moment and let's see how things shake out, see how people gauge and measure their own environment, I guess, against the backdrop of some of what you've been discussing.
I'm offended because I cannot vote. You know, I was going to say very welcoming.
All right. Well, the poll results will pop up in a second when they are ready. We have one question here. What are the main reasons companies are not taking D&I policies, or not, you know, are not taking up any DEIB policies?
You know, I love that question. And I will tell you, you know, because I'm in France, very often I have that conversation, right? And what people will say to me, particularly in France, right? They will say, oh, wow, I see the results of the poll. They're pretty good. They're very good. They're very good.
So we're kind of split there. It seems like there's some improvement needed there. So
you know, the companies particularly in Europe will say that it doesn't matter, meaning your sexual orientation and gender identity is not taken in consideration, right? They will say, well, look, this is your private life, but here we do not discriminate against LGBTQ plus people, right? Everybody is welcome, and there is no discrimination. So that's a very difficult argument to counter, right? To say it doesn't matter. And of course, I will say, well, it does matter, because when you know, very often when LGBT people say, this is my private life, it is statistically correlated to an environment that is not supportive, meaning that, you know, it won't be their private life, it will be their professional life if they get the opportunity to talk about their partner or to be who they are, right? And then similarly, when people say, you know, that happens to me a lot when I talk about the boardroom, people will say, look, sexual orientation and gender identity doesn't matter. We do not care, you know, whether you were born female and are now a male, or we do not care whether you're having sex with someone of your same gender. That we don't talk about that in the boardroom. And I always say, well, look, if you don't care, then, you know, it's very strange that there is such underrepresentation. And I do think that sometimes, you know, it's true that discrimination is not active, right? It's passive discrimination. It's what you're not doing. And I think it's not true only of LGBT people, right? It's true also of gender and race, but some people that might have understood that gender and racial issues are relevant to the workplace, which they didn't believe 50 years ago, right? They now believe it. It's still, you know, might not believe that it's the case for LGBT issues. Now, I will tell you, most companies in the United States are on some kind of a journey, right? But in Europe, it remains a bit behind.
So we have a comment here as LGBT perform better in a workplace by being able to be fully themselves. Is there any data on the effect of non-LGBT employees and their productivity?
That's such a good question. I don't think, meaning what is the impact of being in an LGBT friendly environment on non-LGBT employees, right? Mm-hmm. And that's, you know, of course, nobody has really studied that, although of course it would be interesting. So there are studies that show that LGBTQ plus employees do perform better, right? That they report better productivity, they report better health outcomes too, which of course affect the bottom line of the company, right? Not having mental health issues or sick days. But I'll give you an example. You know, when I was working at the World Bank and I was in the closet, I felt I was an inferior species to my straight colleagues, you know, like, you know, that were speaking in the boardroom. And, you know, that was speaking in the, I say the boardroom, you know, because a lot of what we do at the World Bank is we review documents around the table. So when my turn would come to speak, I would sweat and I would blush, right? Because I had integrated the fact that I was an inferior person because of the way I was raised in a rather homophobic environment. The moment I came out publicly, which is around 28 years old when I became the head of the employee resource group, that burden of shame disappeared. And that's the only moment I started having some level of self-confidence in the workplace. And in fact, a lot of my colleagues were very supportive, right? As much as they had not sent me signal of support before I came out, right? They didn't know I was gay. Once I came out, they were very supportive. And so that completely changed my relationship to work. So I know that this is just an anecdote, right? It's not statistical. But what I mean by that is that it does have an impact, a gigantic impact on how you feel in the workplace.
And there was a sort of a follow-up comment there from this individual. Says, I live in South Beach and people assume that everyone's accepting, but it's not true. And that being out is something that we have to be concerned about because of hidden homophobia. And so there is that.
Yeah, no, I love that because, you know, some of my clients are in cosmetics and fashion. And they really believe, look, I have so many gay people in my company, you know, I am done here. But the problem is that when you start serving those LGBTQ plus employees, they still report some issues, right? Including harassment based on sexual orientation. The fact of having visible gay people in the company is not always correlated to a supportive environment. On the other hand, you know, a very macho company like Dow Chemicals is extremely good on LGBT inclusion, right? So sometimes your geographic location or your industry does not say much about whether you've done the hard work of being LGBT inclusive. And in fact, you know, that's probably the second part of my presentation is what is that hard work, right? What I talked about so far was why it's good business to be LGBT inclusive and why there is a strong human rights argument for companies to do the work. So now what is the work, right? What actions can you take? And so I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that the most important thing is to ensure that the CEO gets it. You know, I'll give you one example. When Hillary Clinton became Secretary of State, she was very convinced, you know, famously about LGBT inclusion being a priority of the American public policy. So she comes at the State Department and she tells all the ambassadors, look, from now on, this is a priority of the foreign policy of the US. I can tell you that the ambassadors were not very happy. Right? They had been dealing with very serious issues like wars, you know, creating peace process, or fighting poverty. And now there is this woman that comes in and says, no, you're also going to have a responsibility to advance LGBT equality. And 2 years later, all the ambassadors were on board. You know, and I remember, in fact, I did a consultation around that time in Uganda for the standard of conduct that I mentioned. And the ambassador spent the entire day, I think she actually hosted the event, and she spent the entire day with the activists discussing the standard. And the reason was tone at the top, right? Hillary Clinton had changed the culture of the State Department because she believed in it. The second action you have to take is review and regularly update your policies, right? So I have one client that has very good policies in terms of harassment and discrimination. So it's very clear in the language of the policy that harassment and discrimination will not be based on sexual orientation, but also based on disability status or veteran status, right? Will not be tolerated. But then they don't have anything, they don't have any policy on transitioning, right? What happened if one of their employees decide to transition, who is in charge of handling the change in the administrative process, right? The change of the gender and the pronouns in the HR system. You know, what is the policy in terms of accessibility, accessing disability benefits, right? Meaning leave when they are getting gender affirming care. What is the policy in terms of informing the other employees that the employee has transitioned, right? They have none of it that is planned, which is completely fine until one employee starts transitioning. And then, you know, it might be a terrible experience for that employee if there's no policy. And they have to kind of make it as they go along. That was my experience when I had twins through surrogacy when I was at the World Bank. You know, I really wanted to have twin leave. The bank didn't know if they should extend it to me. We had to go to mediation. You know, eventually they did give me twin leave, which, believe me, I needed because two little boys, it's a lot at the beginning. And but you know, the policy was not there, and it's kind of uncomfortable when the company is starting to figure it out. You know, whether you're transitioning or you're having kids, right?
Yeah, very interesting. Is that we have another a question here. This is from sort of a food and food supply distribution organization. It says in my company, we literally have to start from scratch with diversity and inclusion policies. Where do we start, and what's your recommendation? How does somebody get off the ground? They have nothing in place with respect to DEIB and
well, look, I mean, you know, I love that, right? I mean, if really you're starting from the beginning, kind of articulate that business case and human rights case and present it to senior management, saying, look, we have to do this. It's our human rights responsibility and it's good for business. And then I would say that the second step is actually to come back to the first human rights responsibility, which is protecting employees from discrimination and harassment. The most important thing is to go back to your employee handbook and your discrimination and harassment policy and ensure that it is spelled out that gender identity and sexual orientation are covered, right? That's kind of the basic. And that there is, of course, you know, mechanisms in place to report harassment and discrimination, because that's the most important thing, right? If you look at famous Supreme Court decisions, you know, recently, what you see is that people are still fired on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, right? Or someone will disclose their HIV status, right? So as an example, it's very important to have a policy on the confidentiality of information shared with managers around sexual orientation and gender identity, because that's the most important. That's probably the cruelest thing that can happen to someone, is to be punished for their sexual orientation and gender identity. So I would say that's the beginning, right? Amending that harassment and discrimination policy. So going back to my third point, right, then, you know, creating clear pathways for career progression. So that's a bit of a weird way to say that LGBT people need a little bit of support to succeed in their career. And that has been showed over and over. And it is due to probably the burden of growing up in a society that is homophobic and transphobic, right? When I grew up, as an example, there was no movie that featured LGBT people, right? And it does something to you. I love to say that the gayest movie I had seen was Midnight Express, and the somewhat gay scene, because it's not very gay, lasted 30 seconds, right? And I did watch it over and over and over. But what I mean is that it does something to you that you carry with you in the workplace, right? And so for LGBT people to have access to networks, whether it's the employee resource group or maybe a professional network like Out Employees in Tech, to also from time to time have people come speak to them about, you know, succeeding as an LGBT people in business. All of that will probably help them maybe be on a level playing field when it comes to career progression. So then the first step that, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, Yes, I have a comment here. A gentleman said, I used to be CEO of a public company when I was 39, when I was closeted. Therefore, I take very pragmatic and practical approaches to looking at these things. Regarding KPIs, which are key performance indicators, how do you adjust them for certain industries that may attract more or less LGBTQ plus people, like the entertainment industry, retail versus industrial and supply chain?
Yeah, and I love that question because it's true that the industry tend to be less progressive than consumer goods. I had a joke when I did the standards, which is that all the companies that express support were all the banks. And I would joke that it's because they created the economic crisis in 2008 and they felt guilty. It was a lot of consumer goods industry, right? Because they are the worst polluters on the planet and they have to get themselves forbidden. And then there were actually a few extractive companies, strangely enough. And that was a bit it, right? It was much more difficult to get heavy industry company to express support. In fact, I was baffled to see that very few companies in the luxury industry express support. So not all industry are equal. And I think it's important to know that there are examples of companies that are doing very well despite being in those industries. And I think Dow Chemical is, to me, might not be always the most sustainable companies when it comes to environmental issues. But in terms of inclusion, not only LGBT inclusion, right? Racial inclusion, gender equality, disability inclusion, veteran status inclusion, they are very, very good. So sometimes your industry, is much less important than the tone at the top. And then, I love also what you said about being a CEO that is in the closet. In the generation that I work with, right, which is the generation that is in the boardroom, a lot of people came out of the closet extremely late in their career. And remember, it's the case of Tim Cook, right? Tim Cook came out very late. Jim Fitterling, CEO of Dow Chemicals, he talks about coming out at 54 after a cancer scare, right? And it's the case for a lot of people of that generation, right? The generation between 50 and 75, right? The generation that is in the boardroom now. And what it means is that, that's one of the reasons why we are underrepresented. But what it also means is that we have to remember that those people would never have made it to the top of business if they had been out. That, it was a good thing for them to stay in the closet because they would not have made it to the top of business. And that's why we have a bit of a deficit at the top of business today, is that people that were out, frankly, did not always make it very far. And there is also an entire generation of men that was decimated by HIV, right, which is not there. And there is nothing more important than to see yourself reflected at the top of business to shape your professional aspirations.
Wonderful. I think we have our second poll question coming up, which I believe is related to something you had mentioned earlier. Go ahead, Elise. All right. So, does your company have a trans-inclusive policy, specific policy? So we'll give that a second and see what the results are there. In the meantime, we have we have a comment, yes, from the same CEO, formerly closeted CEO, said he came out at 48, and so agreeing with your assessment of of the situation. Yeah.
And I know a CEO of a New York Stock Exchange listed company who just got a board seat on a company in the metallurgy sector. And usually, you know, we announce it. We make an announcement, you know, the LGBT Association of Corporate Directors, in which we say, well, look, you know, this person got a board seat, and you know, so that we show our contribution to the boardroom. And that person said to me, they said, look, I would prefer for you not to mention it. And they didn't want, you know, because it's a conservative industry, they didn't want the board and the employees to pick up on the fact that they were gay. And, you know, it was kind of a wake-up call for me that we still have a long way to go.
Yeah. Elise, can you put the results back up again on the screen? It's possible. So we didn't, all right, so yeah, so 56% have no policy, and so yeah, we have 20% in the affirmative, and the rest are either no or unsure, which is probably a no. So there's definitely some work to be done there, and definitely interesting point about not having things in place with respect to everything that would involve someone transitioning, and it's a lot of components, and to kind of be caught flat-footed with no policies and procedures in place to accommodate someone and to handle that situation, I think would send a lot of organizations scrambling. We have one more question here or comment. Same individual. I remember when the one gay guy was promoted to director, and the undercurrent was we promoted one, and that's it. Don't anyone else expect a promotion?
Yeah, which was a bit my experience. You know, when I was at the World Bank, you had the token lesbian at the top of business, and you had nobody else, right? And so every time, you know, there would be a discussion about LGBT equality in the workplace, they would say, well, look, there is that lesbian at the top of business. But, you know, it was one individual who actually was very courageous. And I remember, you know, it was fascinating, you know, that's kind of a topic I will address at the end of the session, which is what can companies do in the public sphere? And that woman, Rachel Kite, she was one of the most powerful person at the World Bank. She was senior vice president for infrastructure. And, you know, we do a lot of infrastructure projects. And she would tell me that she would sit next to the Saudis. And when the Saudis, you know, when she would go to Saudi Arabia for the bank, you know, we had a lot of technical assistance in Saudi Arabia on infrastructure. And when they would say, you know, what about your husband? She would say, I'm married to a woman. And she would say, nobody would blink. Like they would carry on the conversation and be like, oh, okay, where do you live? And, but you know, sometimes you kind of forget the incredible power that people have at the top of business to shape hearts and minds, but also policy debates. I mean, you know, when Elon Musk says something, we all hear about it, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
So it's a big deal. So coming back to the question of trans and non-binary issues.
One question first, before you jump into this slide. We have someone asking, how do you manage employees who claim religious objections to LGBTQ inclusivity? How do you balance the rights of LGBTQ to be affirmed and included, and the right of folks to follow their religious convictions? How do you keep a straight face when listening to, how do you keep a straight face when listening to these religious people? Well,
look,
go back to the first part.
You know, that is a big issue at the World Bank in 2010. You know, we circulated a survey for LGBTQ plus employees, and the managing director, a Nigerian woman called Ngozi, who was actually Minister of Finance of Nigeria, circulated the survey. And she got a letter from Christian employees that said, you know, that there is not such a thing as human rights of LGBT people, that LGBT people are not mentioned in the Declaration of Human Rights, and that why would the World Bank care about the sexual orientation and gender identity of people, and that it hurt their religious conviction. And she responded and she said, may I remind you the non-discrimination values of the World Bank, which was a very big statement, on our part. This was, 13 years ago. So I think it's very important to respect the religious beliefs of everybody in the workplace. I would say that one of the things that I reiterate all the time is that there is no opposition between LGBTQ plus people and religion, right? A lot of LGBTQ plus people are actually religious people. And, I think that all of my life, right, I have friends that are Mormons, and even though the Mormon church is not supportive of LGBTQ plus people, they are very attached to their faith. And, I believe in God. And one time my sister-in-law said to me, she said, oh, I didn't know you had a spiritual life, kind of implying you cannot be a homosexual and have a spiritual life. Well, that's not true, right? I think the spiritual aspiration is a universal aspiration. And so it's very damaging to LGBT people when people oppose religious rights to LGBT rights. LGBT people are also Christians, are also Muslim, are also Jewish people, and they do celebrate holidays. And so I think that's the first thing that is important to remember. I would say the second thing that I would tell people that say, well, look, it hurts my religious freedom, is that your religious freedom stops at discrimination and harassment. You know what I mean? If you are making other employees feel less than, if you are not allowing them, as an example, to display a picture of their partner or a rainbow flag on their desk, then you are actually infringing on their freedom, right? And so you have to balance freedom of religion and protecting employees from discrimination and harassment. And so, very often what I say is that culture and religion cannot trump human rights. And LGBT rights are human rights. LGBT rights are human rights, right? What I think is very important is that you cannot mandate anybody to participate in a pride event, as an example. That's definitely restricting their freedom of religion, right? If they don't want to participate in pride, they don't have to. They don't have to join, right? It's a choice that people make, but they certainly cannot leave a training on sexual harassment that mention LGBT people, right? That's not a freedom that they have. In that case, they might not want to be with that company because the values don't align with their values. So I would say that. But I think it's important to see that a Christian club can coexist with an LGBT employee resource group, and in fact, it does happen all the time. So here are some examples I wanted to give about things you might want to think about to align your policies and practice with trans issues. And when I was at the World Bank, there is one young professional that transitioned. When I was at the IMF, when I was working with the International Monetary Fund, there was one person that transitioned. I think it's happening more and more frequently. I mean, I don't really have any explanation, but as I illustrated when I put the data from Ipsos and Gallup, I think more and more companies are going to be confronted to this. And so, as an example, pronouns is an important question, right? What do you do if you have a millennial that come in your company and wants people to use the they, them pronoun, and you have one employee that doesn't want to, and you tell them, well, you have to, and they say, well, there is no policy that force me to use their pronouns, right? And so it's kind of important to have the policy in place. And my take on this is that you should certainly not force people to put their pronouns on their LinkedIn or their business card, right? I don't put my pronouns on my LinkedIn, and I have a good reason for that, which is I work with a lot of individuals abroad for whom, frankly, pronouns is not relevant at this point. But I do believe that it is discriminating and harassing to other employees if you do not use their pronouns, and I I'm the first one to make mistakes. I have a newsletter that I send every Wednesday. And in one of those newsletters, I misgendered someone, a famous Olympic competitor. And I got a very stern email from a trans person that said, look, that's very hurtful when you make that mistake. And so, you might want to have a policy on pronoun, even if you don't have anybody using pronouns yet. And then, same thing with the bathroom. There's a very famous case in Japan that just went to the Supreme Court in which a manager in the Ministry of Finance asked a transgender person if she could use the bathroom 2 floors below. She was not allowed to use the bathroom on her floor because it made other colleagues uncomfortable. And the Supreme Court decided that this was, I think, illegal and discriminatory, and that the trans person had the right to use the bathroom with the gender she identified on her floor. So again, what if you have a manager that when someone transitions on their team and someone in the team complains and say, well, I don't want such and such to use the same bathroom as I do, it's probably better to have a policy you can refer to, which is that your policy is that anybody can use the bathroom with the gender with which they identify. And even during the transition process, meaning, at whatever stage you're in. And that's a decision you have to make. So, here are some examples of why you can think about these policies. I'll give you an example. This is one of my clients. I looked at the employee handbook, and it's not gendered at all in most of the employee handbook. But then when it comes to 2 parts of the handbook, there is actually gender language. I would say, it's not necessary. And you can actually remove gender language from your employee handbook. It doesn't cost you much. And frankly, if someone does not identify with he or she, not having he or she in the handbook can be a powerful signal,
I have a comment here from the individual who had asked earlier about how do you get started in trying to put policies in place. Said, sharing a little piece of reality. I'm a Mexican immigrant, now U.S. citizen living in New York. Currently performing as director of HR. I've earned respect among my colleagues, but the undertones and innuendos, the smart questions are constantly going back and forth, and it's exhausting drawing boundaries. Employees with less or not or no power at all face bigger challenges. We're all working. We're working hard to update our policies. That I'm married to a male, and I naturally talk about my husband the way that same way heterosexuals talk about their partners. Some people don't know how to act when my comments are shared.
No, and I kind of love that reality check, right? Which is sometimes, I will, I have a client in the extractive industry, right? And a lot of what I talk about is kind of relevant to headquarters. But what about the mine, right? Which is already a very macho environment, and where, people go on shift, and, should they also get training on pronouns, meaning isn't this going to be impossible to do a training on pronoun in Botswana? And so what I tell people is, I say, well, look, it's a journey. You don't have to do everything all at once, right? Even if you start with headquarters and then you start going to, smaller offices, and then eventually you go to the factory, good for you, like develop, what works for you. Now, what I love about the comment is that question of power, right? Which is, frankly, if the CEO is not on board, or if the head of HR, which happens with one of my clients, believes this is a woke agenda that is kind of a distraction from business, it's really difficult to make progress. It's really difficult to make progress. And there's 2 ways a CEO that doesn't care will care. One way is by making a good business and human rights argument. And I think the other way is when there is a lawsuit. Right? If one employee, which happened to one of my clients, if one employee get a really bad experience in a branch, in which the manager is asking very indiscreet question and making that employee very uncomfortable, and there is a lawsuit, then the companies will realize that there is a bottom line impact in not being respectful of the diversity of your workforce. But I agree with you, and you know, when you talk about being exhausted, I'm lucky because I work with a lot of companies that are already on that journey. It's pretty rare that I am facing someone that is not somewhat interested, but I know that the vast majority of small and medium companies in the US are not on that journey at all. And in fact, when you talk to them about this, it feels a bit irrelevant. And so I think that's a very valid point, you know.
Yes, I have one person asking with a sort of a practical logistical question, saying it's one thing with respect to gender bathrooms. How about locker rooms in the exercise area?
Well,
and if you have someone who say, if they've not had, you know, gender affirming procedures, how do you not infringe upon others? How do you manage that, a situation like that?
well, look, and that's very interesting, right? Because I get a lot of hypothetical questions around bathroom, right, as an example. But those questions are usually very detached from the reality of having a transgender employee, right? So let's imagine, as an example, that you work in a company where people have to change in the locker room, right? You know, as an example, let's imagine a fireman station, right? And that fireman is transitioning to female, and she has not had surgery, and she doesn't plan to have surgery, but she wants to change in the same bathroom, in the same locker room as the woman. There is very little chance that she's going to try to make other employees uncomfortable, right? Meaning that there is going to be a situation where other employees will be made uncomfortable by her genitalia, right? And if it is done in a way that is intended to harass and discriminate against other colleagues by the trans employees, there is leverage to say, well, look, this is creating an hostile workplace environment, right? But those worst case scenarios should not distract us from the reality of our common responsibility to accommodate difference in the workplace. You're never going to say to me, well, look, I don't really want to have someone in a wheelchair in my company because it might make our annual picnic impossible because it's not, usually we climb that mountain and it's not wheelchair accessible, right? You're probably going to make an effort to accommodate the person in a wheelchair because you see their common humanity, right? Their desire to be part of a workforce, to fulfill their career potential, to contribute to society, right? And very often those questions come from the idea that trans people are mean people, that are capricious, right? It doesn't come from the idea that, from the reality, right? And I happen through my job to talk to a lot of trans employees. And almost invariably, there's a moment in the conversation when they say to me, either I transition or I kill myself. Almost invariably, right? People that are at the top of business, people that are at Goldman Sachs, people that work for Expedia, they say at some point in the conversation, it was either I transition or I kill myself. Well, the question we have to ask ourselves as HR professionals is that, cannot we make some level of accommodation so that those people do not have that only choice of killing themselves, right? As a society, and as a company, isn't that what we want to aspire for? So what I mean is that you can find a locker room policy that is adequate to your environment, and that is respectful of the desire of someone to have a gender expression that differs from the gender they were born with, because very often it is actually a very legitimate desire for that person.
Good. Do we so where are we, Fabrice, in terms?
Sorry, I get distracted in my presentation.
Yes, no, it's fine.
So now, now I want to talk a little bit about monitoring and evaluation, right? Because I think what really makes a difference is self-identification, giving the opportunity to employees when they are either onboarded or whether there is a staff survey to self-identify, right? Including in the HR system. So there's a lot of questions in terms of privacy, right? Ensuring that this data is kept confidential. There is a lot of questions around, is it legal? Which, by the way, in the United States, it of course is. There is a lot of questions about how to formulate it, right? And there is, one of the key formulation is giving the option to people not to respond, right? It's very important that people have the option not to respond about their sexual orientation or not to respond about their gender identity. But going on that self-identification journey is a game changer, right? Because finally you can measure the things we talk about today, which is loyalty, satisfaction, retention, promotion, and also representation at different levels of the company. I think what is crucial to understand is that self-ID can only take place once you have done all the other work we talked about, which is once you have ensured that there is tone at the top, once you have ensured that the policies are in place, once you have trained your workforce to be respectful of difference in sexual orientation and non-gender and non-conforming gender identity, or being respectful of non-binary identities, because if not, people are not going to self-identify, and it's going to be a very disappointing exercise. So, I have one of my clients that was interested in self-ID, and I said to them, look, you're not ready. Like, it doesn't mean anything for you at this point. You haven't done the work about what are our values, right? And once you have done that work, then, do self-ID, and you will be able to measure progress. And usually it's going to be extremely interesting. So I think, that's a good argument on metrics, right? And then, my last point is going to be intervening in the public sphere. And I know it's slightly irrelevant to our roundtable today because we talk about mostly HR, right? But even from an HR point of view, before you go on your website and you say, look, we are an LGBT inclusive company, right? Or we have this employee resource group, make sure that you have done that hard work. Because I think that a lot of the time when companies get in the news, right, get called out by the left or get called out by the right, it's usually because there is a misalignment between internal culture and external presentation. So, the most striking case is the Anheuser-Busch case. Anheuser-Busch famously had a campaign with Dylan Mulvaney, with a trans influencer, which was widely interpreted as being a pro-trans campaign. And the company changed its mind under pressure from, online activists. And I love, a few journalists called me. I think I have a quote in the Wall Street Journal and a few other magazines around the debacle of Anheuser-Busch. And one of the things that I said is I said, go on their website and look at their senior management team, right? Google Anheuser-Busch and senior management team US. And you will see 15 people, 14 white guys and 1 woman. And the woman is in charge of HR. And the reason I said that is I said, well, look, clearly diversity is not one of their values. In 2023, you don't have a team of, in senior management team of 14 white guys and 1 woman in charge of HR if you do care about diversity. And so, it talks to that misalignment between what the companies try to say about themselves and what the company really is, right? What is their values? What is their and so I think it's very important to always do that balancing act between where are we on our journey to inclusion, and is it time for us to express ourselves on inclusion? And I've seen over the years a lot of companies get in trouble because of that misalignment between their discourse and the lawsuits that were happening, as an example. And I think, I put a few resources here, including my email. And actually, I mistyped my email because it's not .net.
I will. I
blame
put
the
in
jet
the chat
lag.
window.
I blame the jet lag. I blame the jet lag.
I put in the chat window. I did put in the chat window your LinkedIn.
Okay,
So I encourage everyone on the call to connect with Fabrice on LinkedIn. Everyone will receive an email from us, thanking Fabrice for a fantastic presentation, and we thank you so much. And that will include a copy of the video, and we can share the slides with everyone as well. A little bit of housekeeping. Anyone who received their invitation to the HR Roundtable secondhand, or from someone else, if you would like to be on our distribution list, you can just send me an email. I will pop my email address if I can type. There we go. Did I pass the typing test? I passed the typing test. Okay, I popped my email there into the chat window. You can just send me an email, and I will make sure that you get onto our regular distribution list for presentations going forward. We've got some great things lined up for you coming up. And before you know it, it'll be back to school season, and we'll be right into the fall season with our HR roundtables. Everyone, get out there and knock them dead if you don't have policies in place. I think this is a bit of a wake-up call for everyone as to what the possibilities are, and the business case as well as the human rights case for everything that was discussed here. Feel free to reach out to Fabrice if you need help in getting some programs in place. And we will be here also, 10 Positions and the HR Roundtable, as a resource for you to connect you with anything that you need in our field. All right, so thank you, everyone. Get out there and enjoy the great weather. Elise, you can take us out.